Hi there everyone, welcome to the Soul video for week 11. For this week we're going to be focusing on empiricist philosophy of perception. So I had to read a short excerpt from Galileo, a short excerpt from John Locke, and a little bit of Bishop Berkeley. And so in this video, we're really going to try to give you the conceptual tools to be able to understand the debate that they're having amongst each other as empiricists. So, if we've kind of learned over the course of the semester kind of like what the disputes between rationalist philosophers look like, in this week we really want to nail down this is what disputes between empiricist philosophers look like. And as we mentioned in the previous week, and as many of you noted for your homework, understanding the empiricist is going to require us to pay careful attention to the philosophy of our own perceptions and experiences. In the next couple of weeks, we're going to be going through a deep dive on an empiricist, David Hume. And so we're going to get a lot more intricate analysis of our perceptions and what they mean for a broadly empiricist program. So this week really sort of allows us to get an introduction into what these debates look like, so that then we can get a more distinctive image of what Hume's contribution is in the essays concerning human understanding. That's like the big book that we're going to be reading over 2 weeks. That's our sort of like big book by an empiricist, right? Because we read a couple larger texts from the rationalists. So, I've written up at the top of the board, empiricist philosophy of perception. And I want us to pay attention to this leftmost column first initially. The thing about philosophy of perception is that it can be a little bit confusing because you have to introduce terminological distinctions that is sort of like different from how we normally talk, right? I think that it's fairly normal when people are talking about their perceptions to be like, oh, that was a true perception, or that was a false perception, or something to that effect. But when you're doing philosophy and you're really concerned with being as rigorous and particular as possible with your meanings and terminology, then this is not strictly speaking correct, right? We need a different kind of language to talk about what it means when things go right when we perceive things and what it means when things go wrong when we perceive things, right? This is because true and false are things that we attach to sentences or propositions. They are not things that we attach to pictures, right? They're not things that we attach to perceptions. And we're going to give a concrete example of why that is the case. So when we're talking about perceptions, and we want to say that the perception sort of like adequately latches onto reality, it's perceiving in the right way or something like that, then we're going to refer to that perception as veridical, right? What that means is that it kind of like it tracks the truth, right? You're seeing things correctly. You're like engaging in your normal everyday perception, not perception that you have while you're on a bunch of acid, right? Perceptions that you have when you're on a bunch of acid are going to be non-veridical perceptions. In other words, they are perceptions that don't show you the way that things really are. And so when we're talking about perceptions, you want to make sure that you're using the terminology veridical instead of true. And illusion, you can use that instead of non-veridical, for example, instead of false. Okay, so I've insisted on that, but now let's give an example to show why it's important. Consider a situation that I've brought up that I think is just the easiest example of an optical illusion because it's one that you can reproduce yourself at any moment. And that is to imagine a glass full of water that you drop like a pen or a marker or whatever kind of straight, stick-like object into, right? So this is what we're perceiving in this case, right? We see the glass of water, we see the stick going in straight, and then it appears, because of the refraction of the light in the water, to be bent, right? And this is a classical case of an optical illusion. Now, the most important thing about this example is that knowing that it's an illusion does not get rid of the illusion, right? So, like, even if I know that, what's going on is that the water, bends the light or whatever, and that's why it produces the appearance of bending, I still nonetheless see the pen as bent. And please feel free, if you're skeptical about this idea, to perform an experiment yourself. You can take a pencil or whatever else and drop it into a glass of water, and even if you know that it is an optical illusion, you will nonetheless continue to see the pen or the pencil or whatever as if it were bent, right? Okay, so what is the reason for why that's important, right? Well, it's important because if you just run these two different kinds of categories together, then you're liable to make certain kinds of mistakes. So consider these two cases of people perceiving the optical illusion. One person who says it's bent, and the other person who says it didn't bend, right? In the first case, we have a false judgment, right? True and false are categories that apply to judgments, not to perceptions. So in this case, we have a judgment, namely that it bent, right? And this is a false judgment, right? And this false judgment is based on the illusion or the non-veridical perception of the appearance of bending of the object, right? In the second case, you can have a true judgment, but a true judgment that is also based on a non-veridical perception, right? So this, number two, they maybe have listened to the lectures or whatever, right? They know that water bends the light, and so it's going to produce an illusion. And so they see the illusion too. They also have a non-veridical perception, but they nonetheless reach a true conclusion as a result of it, right? If this sounds a little bit confusing, think back to what Descartes said in the Meditations. What Descartes said is that the senses don't deceive us necessarily, right? When we get deceived is when we believe that we can rely on the senses, right? So it's not deceptive per se for me to see, the bent pencil in the glass of water. What is deceptive is when I go on to rely, I judge that that is the case, right? And that's when I enter the realm of truth and falsity, is whenever I use my reason to make an assessment of my perception, right? Perceptions themselves, right, especially imagine the case of optical illusions, are not true or false, and that using this terminology to describe optical illusions or any other kind of illusion will lead you to be massively confused, right? Because it makes a real hash out of this second case. You don't want to say that in the second case they perceived it truly, as if they didn't have an optical illusion. They did have an optical illusion, right? And you don't want to say that they perceived it falsely, right? Because then you're almost implying that the judgment that they made was wrong or something like that, right? Instead, what we really have to do is we have to be particular about distinguishing the level of perception, the way things seem to me, right? And then the level of propositions or judgments, which is what I assess to actually be the case. And the nature of illusions reveals that the way that I see things is not always the way that they are, right? Okay, so this is just to introduce a little bit of terminology that is important for the philosophy of perception. Excuse me. Okay, so now let's continue on the board over here. So what is important about this empiricist moment in the history of philosophy is that this is the first time, or one of the first times, that we have a truly successful reductionist program in science. So what does that mean? A reductionist program attempts to reduce what we do not understand to what we do understand. So, I think that many people would have this reaction. A soul, I don't know what that is, right? There's no way that I could sort of empirically investigate it. The soul is unrelated to the body, at least according to Descartes, right? And so it's not the sort of thing that physical instruments can give us any sort of knowledge about. But the brain is something that we can understand, right? And developments in cognitive science over the last 40 or so years really demonstrate that we can use empirical methods to understand a lot about the nature of the brain. So the contemporary version of this reductionist program would be to say something like, oh, a soul or a mind, I don't know what any of that stuff is. That sounds like philosopher, gobbledygook, right? What I can understand are these things that I can physically, scientifically investigate in the world. And so there's this sort of belief that, you can kind of like reduce the number of these like weird, non-bodily, unscientifically investigatable stuff in the universe and increasingly index it to things that we can understand, right? And the reason why this is so vital and so important to scientific understanding is that you're reducing the amount of like illusions that continue to exist, right? You can think about this as being broadly in line with Cartesianism, right? Where Descartes, at one point said, give me matter and motion and I'll make the physical universe for you, right? And so what's involved in that claim is the idea that everything in the physical universe can be recomposed from matter and motion. So in other words, we can reduce everything in the physical world to only matter and motion. And so this is why the empiricists of the early modern period, so John Locke and Bishop Berkeley and the various, scientific investigators of the time, this is why they are profoundly different, even than people that maybe provide important anticipations of their work. So, for example, Aristotle is often referred to as an empiricist because of the importance that he placed on natural science. However, Aristotle does not have anything like a reductionist program in natural science, right? He doesn't have a modern scientific method. He doesn't really, have this aspect of his own empiricism. And this is a crucial dimension of the early modern period. So now let's talk more about the readings that I've asked you to do for this week. So first we're going to talk about Galileo. Now Galileo, in that small selection from the Assayer, what the essential point here is that Galileo believes that he can successfully reduce this property that he doesn't really understand yet from a scientific standpoint to one that he does understand from a scientific standpoint. So Galileo's program is essentially to reduce heat to motion. And it turns out he's correct about this, right? That when we experience something that's really hot, it's just very small particles moving very fast, right? And so motion is something that we can give sort of like a physical scientific investigation of, right? And heat, at least prior to Galileo, heat seemed like a feeling, right? It seemed like a way that things showed up for us. It didn't really seem like the sort of thing that could, we could provide a scientific investigation of. But it's precisely because heat is reducible to motion that now we can give a genuinely scientific account of heat, right? And so you can kind of see the reductionist program in motion here, and this is what makes modern natural science. And it's also why this mode of thinking is so threatening to religious authorities. Why? Because you're taking increasingly many things that they take to be sort of their territory, their turf, so to speak, right? And you're giving it over to a kind of scientific territory, a scientific turf, right? Okay. So, it's this scientific program, the scientific reductionist program, that really offers the foundation for approaches in philosophy of perception. As I mentioned, Locke was very influenced by Francis Bacon and the idea of a modern scientific approach to philosophy. And he attempted to actualize that program philosophically, not only scientifically. And so Locke conceived of a model of perception where we can neatly divide properties of the object into what he calls primary and secondary qualities, right? So let's just give an account of this weird drawing I've done, right? So there is something out there in the world, right? This is the thing that we see or perceive or whatever. It exerts some sort of causal influence on us. I've just drawn myself. Anytime they have, the stick figure has goofy curly hair, that's me, right? And the idea is that when an object exerts causal force on us in some way, this produces a mental representation of that object, right? So in this case, there's something out there in the world, it comes to affect me, and then I think of it, and I think of it as having all of these different properties, right? Now the thing is, what the primary secondary quality distinction is meant to capture is that there will be some properties that belong to the object as it is in itself, right? And there will be other properties that are generated only through the interaction with me, right? And so we can think about this as being the domain of primary qualities and this as being the domain of secondary qualities, right? So here's the idea, right? The realm of primary qualities, this is supposed to be the stuff that physics investigates, right? This is the shape, the size, the motion of physical objects, right? These are the things that physics has the tools and appropriate methodology to come to understand, right? And we think about objects as having a shape, a size, and motion. We think about them as having these properties regardless of whether or not I see it, right? So if we're imagining I'm looking at this book, then the book, in order to have a causal influence on me at all, it must have its own shape and size and motion, right? But now it also takes on additional secondary characteristics as a result of being perceived by me in particular, right? And so you can think about secondary qualities as being qualities that emerge because of the mixture of the original object and the effect it has on me, right? And this is where we get optical illusions. This is where we get disagreement in our perceptions. This is why we don't see the universe as it actually is because there's various aspects of our perception that deal not with the way that the universe is in itself, but only with the way that we come to be affected by objects, right? So take taste, for example. Taste is maybe the easiest one to imagine, right? A book is kind of a strange one to imagine in this case, but nonetheless, we'll do it, right? I lick the book or I take a bite or whatever, right? And it's going to taste a particular way to me in particular, right? And ultimately, the taste of a book, that doesn't belong to the book, right? That belongs to the way that it affects my taste buds, right? And so taste is a result of the shape and motion and size of various parts as they touch my tongue and run across my tongue, right? So too similarly with color. In the case of color, you know, the way that I perceive the color of a given object is related to how well my eyes take in light, right? And it's also a feature of, namely, the shape of certain molecules, like in dye and stuff like that, that they reflect certain kinds of light and absorb other kinds of light, right? And so the point is that you can ultimately reduce these secondary qualities to primary qualities, right? Color you can describe as being the shape of various sort of molecules, like I said, and how they reflect light. Taste too can be reduced to shape, size, and motion insofar as taste is, the relationship between your taste buds and the material on your tongue. Heat, Galileo already has reduced heat to motion, and then like whether or not something is pleasurable or not, right? There's obvious disagreement. What shows up to me as pleasurable might show up to you as not pleasurable, right? What shows up to me as having color, a distinctive color, might show up to someone who's colorblind as not having that color, right? You can imagine, I don't know, 90-degree water or something like that, and that can be very hot for me if I'm cold, and that can be cold for someone else, right, in a certain circumstance. So the secondary qualities admit a ton of variability, and they're a result of the interaction between the object causing our perception and your own sensory perceptual apparatus, right? And so what this distinction allows Locke to do is it allows him to divide the world into primary qualities, which describe this is how the world is. These are the things, the way that the world is in itself. If there were no perceivers in the universe, then things would still have a shape, a motion, and a size, right? But there would not be, if there were no perceivers in the universe, any color, taste, heat, pleasure, etc., because these things all are the result of the interaction between an object and a perceiver. And so Locke thinks, okay, well, this philosophy of perception, what it really allows you to do is to begin to make a scientific distinction between those aspects of our perception that are veridical, that to show the world as it really is, and those aspects of our perception that are, at least in part, illusory, right? That are non-veridical, that show us only how stuff shows up for us, right? Not how the world is by itself or in general. Okay, that's Locke. Now, Berkeley, I'm going to give a relatively short explanation of because I think it's very interesting, but it's most interesting as sort of a challenge to the Lockean view, right? Locke's view is very, very appealing to us because it gives us something like a scientific way of thinking about our perceptions and to be able to make a rigorous distinction between primary and secondary qualities based on scientific evidence, right? But Berkeley's question to Locke is, what is this X that you're talking about? What do you mean something you don't perceive, something you don't know, causes perceptions in you? Where do you get to make that leap, right? For Berkeley, what we really see is just ideas or perceptions relate to other ideas, right? We don't ever get outside the sphere of our own head, right? It's not like we can compare, my idea of a book with the way that the book really is, right? We have no perception of what the book really is in itself or something like that, right? And similarly, while Locke would want to say something like, secondary qualities are agent relative while primary qualities are not agent relative, Berkeley will really push on this idea that primary qualities are not agent relative because he'd be like, what are you talking about? Isn't how big something seems a result of perspective, right? So, like, if you put something right in front of your face versus very far out, right? Doesn't that obviously mean that the perspective that you have on it affects the shape, size, and motion, and so on? And so, Berkeley, like Leibniz, ultimately says that this distinction between primary and secondary qualities is untenable. We do not have, if you're a true empiricist, right, we don't have any experience of this unknowable X that is the cause of our perceptions. We just proceed from one perception to the next, right? And so it's very interesting, right? Because ultimately what happens in Locke's view is that Locke, at least from the Berkeleyan perspective, is that Locke really wants to provide a rigorous scientific account of our perception, but in order to do so, Berkeley says, he moves beyond our perception, right? He's no better than the rationalists because he's positing something that we do not know and by definition can have no experiences of, that's supposed to be the explanation for all the things that we do have experiences of. And so Berkeley is an idealist. Berkeley thinks that all that exists are agents and perceptions. If you are a true empiricist, right, you're only going to believe in those things that you have experiences of, then you cannot maintain this distinction between primary and secondary qualities. Okay, I want to keep this video short for this week. I hope that this was helpful to everyone. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please reach out. Thanks.